I didn't recognize the person crying softly in the mirror, and somehow that scared me more than if I had. The tears came before the understanding, before the words, before I could even decide whether this moment was something I was allowed to have. All I knew was that my chest felt too full, like I'd been holding my breath for years and had just remembered how to exhale. The mirror stood there, unblinking, reflecting not just a face in transition but a lifetime of quiet questions finally asking to be heard. I grew up learning how to perform boyhood the way you learn a script. Memorize the lines, hit the marks, don't improvise. I was good at it, too. I laughed when I was supposed to, lowered my voice without thinking, stood a little stiffer than I felt inside. No one ever told me I was doing it wrong, which somehow made it harder to admit that it never felt right. The mirror back then was just glass. It showed me what everyone else expected to see, and I learned to nod along. The first time I let myself imagine something different, it felt like betrayal. Not of anyone else, but of the version of me that had worked so hard to fit. I remember standing alone in my room, holding a piece of clothing that wasn't meant for me. At least, that's what I'd been taught. My hands shook as if I were holding evidence of a crime. The mirror was there even then, catching my hesitation, reflecting the fear before I could name it. When I finally tried it on, nothing dramatic happened. No lightning, no sudden clarity. Just a strange quiet, like a room after the music stops. I looked at myself and felt two opposing truths collide. This isn't me, and this feels like me. The mirror didn't choose sides. It simply showed me what was there, patiently, as if it had always known I'd come back to this moment. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of a possibility settle in my chest. What if this wasn't a phase or a joke or curiosity? What if this was a door I'd cracked open and couldn't close again? The fear was real, sharp and practical, but beneath it was something warmer, something like hope, and that scared me most of all. The next morning, when I caught my reflection again, I realized the mirror had changed roles. It was no longer just showing me who I was supposed to be. It was asking me who I wanted to become. The mirror became a quiet accomplice after that, always waiting, never judging. Every time I passed it, I felt its pull, like it knew something about me I was still learning how to say out loud. I started lingering in front of it longer than necessary, adjusting my hair, studying my posture, imagining softer edges where I'd always been told to be sharp. These moments were small, almost invisible to the outside world, but inside me they echoed loudly. At first, I told myself it was temporary, a curiosity, a private experiment that would fade once I satisfied it. But curiosity doesn't usually come with this kind of emotional gravity. I noticed how my shoulders relaxed when I allowed myself to move differently, how my breathing slowed when I stopped forcing myself into shapes that didn't fit. It was unsettling to realize how much effort I'd been spending just to look normal. I practiced in fragments, little stolen moments when I was alone. A different way of standing. A softer expression in my eyes. Sometimes I'd laugh at myself, half nervous, half amused, like I was watching someone else rehearse a role they weren't sure they were brave enough to perform in public. Other times, the laughter vanished, replaced by a lump in my throat I couldn't explain. The fear showed up quickly, practical and relentless. What would people say? What would my friends think if they saw me like this? Really saw me? I imagined their faces, the confusion, the jokes that might hide discomfort, the silence that would hurt the most. Each imagined reaction felt like a hand pressing against my chest, urging me to stop before I went too far. And yet, every time I considered stopping, something inside me resisted. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was more like a steady pulse, a reminder that pretending had costs, too. I'd spent so long managing other people's expectations that I'd forgotten how to listen to my own. The mirror reflected that conflict perfectly, one face, holding two lives in tension. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted my room in soft gold, I caught a glimpse of myself that felt different. For just a second, the reflection didn't feel like an experiment or a disguise. It felt honest. The realization hit me hard enough that I had to sit down. Honesty, it turned out, was terrifying, but it was also relieving in a way I hadn't known I needed. That night, I made a quiet promise to myself. I didn't define it, didn't label it, didn't announce it to anyone. I simply promised not to look away anymore. The mirror had shown me enough to know that whatever this journey was, it deserved my attention. The next step didn't arrive with fireworks or certainty. It crept in slowly, disguised as an ordinary day. I remember standing in my room, door locked, heart beating louder than it needed to, holding clothes that weren't meant for me. Or at least, that's what I'd been taught to believe. The fabric felt unfamiliar in my hands, lighter somehow, as if it carried a different set of rules. I hesitated longer than I want to admit, caught between impulse and fear, until impulse finally won by exhaustion. When I put them on, it wasn't transformation that hit me first, it was silence. The kind where the noise in your head pauses, just for a breath. I expected embarrassment, maybe even shame, but instead there was a strange calm, like I'd stepped into a room where I could finally hear myself think. I looked down, then back up at the mirror, bracing for rejection from my own reflection. What stared back wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished or confident or ready for the world. But it was real in a way that startled me. My posture changed without instruction. My movements softened naturally, like my body had been waiting for permission. That scared me more than anything else. How easily it all came once I stopped resisting. Then the doubts rushed in. Was I fooling myself? Was this just novelty dressed up as meaning? I paced the room, replaying old conversations, old rules, old warnings about what was acceptable and what wasn't. Each memory tugged me backward, reminding me of the version of myself everyone expected me to remain. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something irreversible without knowing what waited on the other side. But when I tried to change back, really tried, I felt a loss I hadn't anticipated. The absence of that quiet alignment hurt more than the fear of discovery. It was like stepping out of warm light into a colder space, familiar but less kind. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about clothes or appearances. It was about relief. About letting my inside and outside stop arguing for once. Later that night, I caught myself humming softly, an old song I hadn't thought about in years. The sound surprised me. I didn't remember the last time I'd done something so unguarded. The mirror caught that moment too, reflecting not just how I looked, but how I felt, lighter, uncertain, but undeniably awake. I knew then that I couldn't unlearn what I'd felt. Whatever came next, confusion, courage, consequences, I had crossed a line within myself. And there was no pretending I hadn't. The world didn't change the next morning. But I did. I noticed it in the smallest details first. The way I stood in front of the mirror a little longer than usual, the way my hands moved more carefully, as if I was still carrying something fragile from the night before. I kept expecting the feeling to fade, to reveal itself as a temporary illusion, but instead it lingered, steady and patient. All day, that quiet sense of alignment followed me like a secret melody only I could hear. In conversations, I felt split, half present, half somewhere else, replaying the memory of that reflection, that calm. I caught myself wondering what people would see if they really looked at me. Not what they assumed. Not what I performed. What was actually there. That evening, the mirror called to me again. I didn't rush this time. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if acknowledging the seriousness of what I was doing. Each small change felt symbolic, less about transformation and more about recognition. When I finally looked up, my breath caught in my throat. The reflection wasn't asking questions anymore. It was waiting for answers. Fear crept in alongside the wonder. What if someone found out? What if this truth cost me friendships, respect, safety? The possibilities stacked up quickly, heavy and sharp. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, bargaining with myself. Maybe I could keep this part hidden forever. Maybe that would be enough. But the mirror disagreed. Every time I looked back at it, it reminded me of something I couldn't ignore. I had felt whole, if only briefly. And once you know what wholeness feels like, fragments become unbearable. I realized I wasn't chasing attention or escape. I was chasing honesty. I whispered my own name aloud, testing how it sounded in this new context. The sound wavered, but it didn't feel wrong. It felt unfinished. Like the beginning of a sentence I'd never allowed myself to complete. That night, as I turned off the light, I knew the question wasn't whether this journey would continue, but how brave I would be when it did. The first time I stepped outside carrying that truth with me, it felt like walking into daylight after years in a dim room. Nothing about the street was unusual, the same cracked pavement, the same passing cars, but my senses were sharper, almost tender. Every sound seemed closer, every glance heavier, as if the world could somehow tell that something inside me had shifted. I kept my shoulders tense, my pace careful, rehearsing normalcy in my head. Don't draw attention. Don't slip. Don't let the secret show. Yet beneath that anxiety was a quiet thrill, a pulse of excitement I hadn't expected. I wasn't pretending anymore, not fully. Even dressed the way I always had been, I felt different, as if an invisible layer had been peeled away. Later, alone again, I returned to the mirror. It had become my compass, my witness. I experimented with small things, subtle changes that only I would notice. Each one sent a ripple through me, a mix of fear and pride colliding in my chest. I laughed softly at myself at one point, not out of mockery, but disbelief. How had something that started so quietly grown this loud inside me? The tension peaked when my phone buzzed with a message from a friend asking to hang out. My stomach tightened instantly. The thought of being seen, really seen, sent my thoughts spiraling. I stared at the screen, weighing honesty against safety, desire against habit. For a moment, I almost declined, choosing comfort over courage. But then I caught my reflection again, and the look staring back wasn't accusing, it was hopeful. That look made the decision for me. I said yes, even though my hands shook while typing it. Even though I had no idea what the next step would look like. As I got ready, I realized something surprising. Courage didn't arrive as a dramatic surge. It came quietly, disguised as resolve. I wasn't suddenly fearless, I was simply unwilling to go backward. Whatever happened next, I knew I would face it as myself, not as a shadow of who I used to be. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and opened the door, feeling the story move forward whether I was ready or not. Meeting my friend that day felt like standing on a narrow bridge between two versions of my life. Every step toward the cafe echoed with questions I couldn't silence. Did they notice something different in the way I walked, the way I held myself? Or was all of this only roaring inside my own head? When I walked in, the familiar smell of coffee and chatter wrapped around me like muscle memory. My friend waved, smiling the same easy smile I'd known for years. And for a moment everything felt normal enough to breathe again. We talked about ordinary things, work, random stories, plans we never quite followed through on. Yet beneath every word, I felt that quiet truth humming, steady and insistent. Then something small happened. My friend paused mid-sentence, looked at me more closely, and said, almost casually, "You seem different. Happier, maybe." My heart skipped so hard I thought it might give me away. I laughed it off, but inside, that single observation landed like a bell ringing. Someone had sensed it. Not the clothes. Not the details. The feeling. On the walk home, that moment replayed again and again. I realized I wasn't just changing how I looked in private, I was changing how I existed in the world. The idea terrified me, but it also filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt before. For the first time, the change wasn't invisible. That night, the mirror reflected more than an image. It reflected progress. I studied my face, my posture, the subtle confidence beginning to take root. The recurring fear was still there, of course, whispering about consequences and loss. But it was quieter now, drowned out by something stronger, curiosity about who I could become. I pressed my hand lightly against the glass, as if sealing a promise. Whatever this was turning into, I wasn't alone with it anymore, not even with myself. And I knew, deep down, that the next step would ask more of me than I'd ever given before. The next step arrived sooner than I expected, disguised as an ordinary invitation. A small gathering. Familiar faces. Nothing dramatic on the surface, yet my hands trembled as I read the message. The mirror caught me pacing, rehearsing imaginary conversations, imagining every possible reaction. I kept asking myself the same question. Was I brave enough to show up as I was becoming, not just as I'd been? Getting ready felt different this time. Less like a secret ritual, more like preparation for something real. Each choice, What to wear, how to style myself, carried weight. I wasn't chasing perfection. I was chasing honesty. When I finally looked at my reflection, I didn't feel shock anymore. I felt recognition. Like meeting someone I'd known all along but never let speak. At the gathering, the room buzzed with laughter and noise, and for a moment I hovered at the edge, half tempted to disappear. Then someone smiled at me. Just a simple, unremarkable smile, and the tension in my chest loosened. Conversations flowed. Jokes landed. Time moved. And with every passing minute, the fear that had once screamed inside me softened into a low, manageable hum. There were moments of doubt, of course. A glance held too long. A question that felt a little too curious. Each one sent a spark of panic through me, but none of them exploded the way I'd always imagined. Instead, I stayed. I listened. I existed. And that, I realized, was the bravest thing I'd ever done. When I stepped outside afterward, the night air felt cooler, sharper, like a reset. I caught my reflection in a dark window and smiled without thinking. The person looking back wasn't pretending anymore. Not to the world, not to themselves. The journey hadn't erased my fear, but it had given me something stronger to stand on. And as I walked home under the quiet glow of streetlights, I understood that this wasn't just about transformation. It was about permission, the permission I'd finally given myself to be seen, even if I didn't yet know where that visibility would lead. The next morning, the mirror greeted me differently. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden revelation, no cinematic gasp, but there was a calm there that hadn't existed before. I stood still longer than usual, noticing how my shoulders rested instead of tensed, how my expression looked settled. The mirror had become my quiet witness through all of this, and now it seemed to reflect something steadier, something earned. Messages began to trickle in. Simple ones. Had a great time last night. Hope you got home safe. Each notification sent a small wave of relief through me. No awkward follow-ups. No sudden distance. Just normalcy. And somehow, normal felt extraordinary. I realized how low my expectations had been. How much rejection I'd braced for without even noticing. Still, doubt has a way of sneaking in through the cracks. Alone again, my mind replayed moments from the night before, magnifying every pause, every half-second of silence. I wondered who had noticed more than they let on. I wondered who might talk later. The fear didn't vanish. It tested me, asking if I really believed I deserved the peace I was feeling. Later that day, I went out alone. No event, no reason, just me and the world. Walking past strangers, standing in line, ordering a drink, I felt exposed and invisible at the same time. Each interaction was brief, ordinary, and yet deeply affirming. No one stared. No one questioned. The world didn't stop. It simply made room. I caught my reflection again, this time in a shop window, and the recurring symbol returned to me. The mirror, no longer an enemy, no longer a thrill, but a companion. It didn't ask me who I was supposed to be. It only showed me who I already was becoming. As the sun dipped lower and the day softened, I felt a quiet pride rise up, not loud or flashy, but solid. I hadn't reached an ending. I hadn't solved everything. But I'd crossed a line I could never uncross, and for the first time, that thought didn't scare me. It felt like standing at the edge of a new chapter, pages blank, heart steady, knowing that whatever came next would be written honestly, even if the handwriting shook at first. That evening, my phone buzzed with a video call from my closest friend, the one who had quietly supported me through everything without ever pushing. I hesitated before answering, suddenly aware that seeing her face again might bring back every ounce of self-consciousness I'd been trying to shake off. But when her familiar grin appeared on the screen, the tension in my chest loosened just a fraction. "Wow," she said, her eyes widening slightly. You look incredible." There was no hesitation in her voice, no awkwardness, just honesty. And that honesty hit me like a wave I hadn't expected. I laughed, nervously at first, then more freely. The sound was unfamiliar in my own ears, a mixture of relief and pride. We talked for what felt like hours. About nothing important. About everything. About fears, about small victories, about how the world sometimes seemed to tilt sideways when you dared to be yourself. Each word from her, Each tiny affirmation chipped away at the lingering self-doubt. I realized that acceptance wasn't just about the mirror, or the makeup, or even the way I walked. It was about connection. About letting someone see you and letting yourself be okay with that. Later, when the call ended, I sat alone again in the quiet of my room. But the room felt different this time. Not smaller, not constricting, but expansive. I felt the soft hum of courage in my veins, that slow, steady pulse that says, "You can do this. You can keep going. And maybe, just maybe, the world will bend enough to meet you halfway." For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was pretending. I felt like I was living. Not perfectly, not without fear, but alive. Fully, beautifully alive. The next day brought its own challenges, quieter but sharper in their way. I had to step outside my apartment, into the unpredictability of the world, fully dressed, fully me. Every step toward the street felt heavy with anticipation, like walking on a tightrope I hadn't realized I'd built over months of uncertainty. I held my head a little higher, adjusted my jacket, and tried to steady the rhythm of my heartbeat. People passed without notice, or so it seemed, but the occasional glance that lingered longer than polite caught me off guard. I reminded myself, it wasn't about them. It was about me standing in the world without apology. And yet, a flicker of fear whispered in the back of my mind, tugging at the edges of my confidence. At a cafe, I waited in line, my reflection bouncing off the glass of the display counter. I studied my features, the subtle contours of my face softened by a touch of makeup, the careful curl of my hair, the poised tilt of my shoulders. A small smile broke across my face. This was me. Not a costume, not a joke, not an experiment. Me. When my order was called, a stranger addressed me with a warmth I wasn't expecting. "Here you go." My stomach fluttered, a mixture of shock and exhilaration. For a moment, time seemed to pause, and I felt the same thrill I had felt months ago, only now tempered with calm recognition. I wasn't invisible, but I also wasn't performing. I was simply being. I found a corner table and sat, letting the moment sink in. The city moved around me, indifferent, bustling, alive. And so was I, in a way I had never allowed myself before. I realized that the mirror hadn't taught me this. I had. Every small choice, every quiet step into myself, had led to this moment. Being seen, and seeing myself without fear. By evening, I found myself walking through a familiar park, the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the path. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of winter and something I couldn't quite name. Freedom, maybe, or possibility. I breathed deeply, letting the chill settle into my lungs, letting the quiet hum of the world remind me that I existed beyond the confines of my own anxiety. I passed a small group of people laughing near a fountain. For a fleeting moment, a familiar doubt flickered. What if they saw me differently? What if this persona, this version of me, didn't fit in here at all? But then I felt it again. The pulse of courage that had been building inside me for months. I lifted my chin, squared my shoulders, and kept walking, my steps light but deliberate. I caught my reflection in the darkened glass of a nearby shop window. The person staring back was both familiar and astonishing. The shape of my face, the subtle arch of my brows, the gentle curve of my lips, all of it spoke of a self I had only begun to know. And in that reflection, there was something more, pride. Not loud or boastful, but steady, soft, undeniable. Pride in having dared, in having stepped beyond fear, in having taken the quiet leap into authenticity. Sitting on a bench, I watched the world drift by, people wrapped in their own lives, unaware of the small revolutions happening in the hearts of strangers. And yet, I felt the weight of my own revolution, subtle but immense. I realized that this journey wasn't about being accepted by everyone. It was about accepting myself fully, in every fragment, in every mirrored reflection, in every whispered affirmation from friends, in every step forward when the path felt uncertain. The days that followed were not always easy. Some people stared, some asked questions I wasn't ready to answer, and some simply didn't understand. But each encounter, each hesitant smile or gentle nod of recognition, became a thread weaving a new tapestry of who I was, no longer half hidden, no longer pretending. I began to feel a rhythm in my life, a cadence where fear once lived, and in its place bloomed something fragile but unstoppable: confidence. One afternoon, I found myself back in front of a mirror. The same mirror that had once reflected a boy unsure of his place in the world. I studied the face looking back at me now. It was the same face, and yet it wasn't. The eyes held certainty. The lips, a soft, knowing smile. The posture, an elegance I had once only imagined. I realized that the transformation hadn't been just about clothes, makeup, or hair. It had been about permission. Permission to be seen, permission to be known, permission to be myself. Later, I met with my closest friends. I braced myself, half expecting hesitation, maybe even judgment. But instead, they looked at me and smiled. Not at the dress, not at the hair, not at the carefully painted nails, but at me. And in that simple acknowledgement, a rush of emotion flooded through me. Relief, joy, pride. I had crossed an invisible threshold, moving from fear to authenticity, from hiding to living fully in my truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. My journey was not just about transformation, it was about revelation. About discovering that being myself, wholly and unapologetically, was not only possible, it was beautiful. I touched the mirror one last time, smiled, and whispered softly to the reflection, "This is me. Finally, truly me."